Games 1 and 2 of the Fischer random match between Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura were drawn. Going into Game 3, this was the starting lineup that the players were presented with just 15 minutes before the start of the game. So there we are. You just take that in before you go any further. As ever, I think we're discovering after the first 2 games that the classical principles of normal chess apply in Fischer Random. Basically, you have to develop your pieces, controlling the center is very important, and castling is also important, or let's just say bringing your king to safety. So let's just very quickly see how Game 3 started. So this was Nakamura with white, played f3, so clearly he's looking to develop his bishop, and that will enable his king to switch around with king and rook and castle. So remember, when they castle, the king always ends up on g1 and rook on f1 as normal, or on the queen side c1 and d1 as normal. c6 from Carlsen, preparing to bring this bishop into the game. c4, so center is very important. Likewise, Carlsen staking a claim in the center with the pawn. And, well, already white has a slight space advantage. Slightly unusual position in that Carlsen declined to play the f-pawn forward. So that means his bishop at the moment is locked in, so it's obviously not easy to castle. Whereas Nakamura, in playing pawn to f3, can bring his king, well, to relative safety, bring his rook into the game. So that's why Carlsen here played h5 in order to bring his bishop into the game and potentially to get castled as well. The game very quickly reached an end game, and at this stage, well, I think we can say that Nakamura certainly has a slightly better position, much easier position for white to play than black, because, well, black's king can't castle on the king side at any rate. This bishop is obviously very poor on b8, and white can, well, get castled very quickly and rearrange his pieces very easily and into a very harmonious setup. So Carlsen a bit worse here, but he turned the game around and at some moment was even better, but, well, I think this is a relatively fast time control. It's very hard to play a technically accurate game under those circumstances, and the game ended in a draw. But I would like to concentrate, if you don't mind, just on Game 4. So, first 3 games drawn, and now Carlsen has the white pieces. So instead of Nakamura's f3, he went with d4. The players had, I think, just about over an hour to prepare from this position. So, I mean, it's not a huge amount of time. You can't do a lot of in-depth research. d4 played, c5 from Nakamura, so immediately striking against the center. I mean, that has pros and cons. I mean, one of the disadvantages, a bit like when black plays the Scandinavian against e4, is that the queen has come out very early, and that means that white can gain some time against the queen. So the queen dropped back. Well, that's a very interesting move. Queen c7. I mean, it looks such an ugly move, I have to say, blocking the bishop and the knight as well. So why did Nakamura play like this? Well, basically he's preventing Carlsen from castling very easily. So, you know, white wants to bring out this bishop and get castled on the king side, but obviously in that case h2 would be en prise and that would be checkmate instantly. So that's the reason Nakamura played this, but it's not a beautiful move, actually. Somehow I can't imagine Carlsen making a move like that. Now, if e4, here's a very interesting moment, and this is very surprising. black can play f5, giving up a pawn, and after the check, white cannot interpose with the knight because of the pin here. So the king would have to step up to f2, and then black castles, and suddenly, well, the king looks very awkwardly placed there. And black has managed to castle, bring his rook into the game. So instead of playing e4, Carlsen played quite an unusual move, bringing his queen out, avoiding a potential pin on the c file, also preventing black from playing d5. So not a bad move, queen d2 at all, a careful move. Now, black needs to sort his king out, and Nakamura therefore played f5 to bring the bishop into the game. I'm not sure about that. I mean, I think I would perhaps prefer f6. Why am I unsure about f5? Well, it exposes the king to a certain extent, and after, well, this pawn shouldn't be taken by the queen because d7 is on prise. But bishop takes c4, bishop takes f5, and white just has a slightly better pawn structure here. Also, there are more pawns around white's king. Black's king is going to be less well defended, and this is a factor in the game. So let's see how things develop. So knight comes out attacking the bishop retreats. Knight comes out and the rook to c1. Okay, this all looks very standard. Nice simple development opposite the queen, and the bishop comes back. Bishop b3. Yeah, if e4 straight away, then knight c4 is a bit irritating. So bishop b3 cuts out any quick counter-attack for black. Now, it's possible just to exchange on b3, but it's all a question of time. Instead of that, Nakamura preferred to castle on the king side. There we go. When the king and rook swap, they always end up in the standard classical chess position. So why did Nakamura not exchange on b3, damaging white's pawn structure? Well, it's all about time. Carlsen exchanged, and that brought the knight to a better position. So e4. And the knight came out, so the knight's moving off the back rank. Yeah, I was sort of thinking that it might be better to bring this bishop out here, but white still can't castle because of this. So that's why Carlsen went for knight e3, and then simply bishop f2, and then, well, we'll see in a couple of moves, he's going to bring his bishop to g3. And in that way, yeah, I mean, basically, he's now ready to play bishop g3, and then he'll be ready to switch king and rook. So Nakamura preempts that by moving his king across. And now we can see that the game has, well, taken on the familiar contours of a classical chess position, and there's no doubt that Carlsen will be would have been the happier of the two players out of the opening, because black's structure is not as good as white. So there are 3 pawn islands. The pawn on d7 is potentially a little bit weak, but also black's king is potentially weak as well. That's why I didn't like this move f5, because it does expose the king. So this bishop came out, and this trade is quite nice for white. The double pawn doesn't matter. In fact, it can help white. The king has an escape square on h2. And now here's an interesting moment. To my eyes, I would play rook d1 very quickly and just to build pressure. And there's no doubt that white is a bit better here. Pleasant position. But Carlsen has spied, well, not just a problem with pawn here, but a problem with the king. It's not just the king is slightly exposed. Black's queen is way across the other side of the board and does not connect with the king side very well. So Carlsen decides it's time to attack black's king. He can move his queen across, and yeah, it's not so pleasant for black when the queen can't match white's queen coming over to the other side of the board. So queen g5. Very interesting that Carlsen does this. You know, his antennae is pretty sharp. So that at least the knight comes over to protect black's king. But white now goes back to pressing on the d-pawn. So, I mean, we can see that all white's pieces are in play. White has a slight initiative. Remember, the time control is 45 minutes to get to move 40, and then they have 15 minutes for the whole game. So it's a kind of semi-rapid game, not quite classical time control. And Nakamura normally is very good with this kind of time control. Zurich Chess Challenge, for example, last April, he was dominant there. But, of course, Magnus is pretty good at rapid play himself. So you can see that Carlsen has tucked the king away. King is safe, and he's on the attack with his queen and potentially the knight as well. So it's a dangerous position for black. So, for example, if queen a7 here, then the queen comes back, threatening a check. And now just f4, and this is already very, very dangerous. You can see black's major pieces just way across on the other side of the board. So Nakamura played well here. He played his rook back to c5, stopping queen g5 for the moment, potentially looking to counterattack with a rook h5, hassling the king. Rook d6. Now, it might have been better for Nakamura to check the king and then just come back again. And potentially, well, more checks and maybe a queen a7 as well. But instead he played b4, which is just a little bit loose. And here's what happened. Rook b6, hitting the queen. And now e5. So that means, obviously, that it cuts out this possibility of rook h5 check. So the king is more secure now. And now black has to be very careful. In playing e5, Carlsen has done a spot of calculation, because at first glance you think, oh my word, rook c8. Well, of course, if this is taken, then black has relieved a lot of the pressure. But what was Magnus's idea? He didn't take the rook. He played queen e7, so that if queen takes rook, then knight f6 forces a checkmate. No defense to queen g7. Likewise, if king h8, then knight h5. So very sharply played by Carlsen. Not that this is the end of the world, but knight g6 drives the queen away, but of course it's very happy to take this pawn. That's why b4 just looked a little bit loose. Nevertheless, this is not a simple position at all. h5 is an excellent move, hitting the knight, and the e-pawn, of course, is vulnerable. And so actually Nakamura survives this. I mean, there are various endgames that Carlsen could go for. You know, you could trade and move the knight back, but then the e-pawn drops. But Carlsen decides to play queen e4. So we get a trade of pieces. And now queen d5. Good move, hitting the rook, defending the d-pawn. The rook comes back. So if we do a count of the pawns, white for the moment is a pawn up, but there are lots of trades happening. You know, there are fewer pawns on the board now. And yeah, this is not going to be easy at all. And you can see now, well, the double pawns do a good job of defending the king, but of course, well, you'd prefer to have them straightened out. Queen takes e5. More pawns being traded, but white is still a pawn up. And now Carlsen has to be careful of this counterattack. So he checks on d8, forces the rook back. So of course Carlsen has a draw here. And he repeated moves to get to the time control. They were both running a little bit short of time, and now Carlsen can make a decision about what to do. Well, he couldn't find anything better than just to trade rooks, and queen and pawn endgames are notoriously difficult to win. But Carlsen is a pawn up, and he does have the advantage that his king is protected by these double pawns to some extent, but not easy. Black also has a passed pawn, and his queen is very active. Let's see what happens. So Carlsen looking to exploit his pawn majority on the queen side, but because this queen is so active, it's not easy. Now here is a very difficult moment in the game. Remember, the players had 15 minutes added to their clock after the time control at move 40, and that's no increment. So they're playing to a finish, just 15 minutes. And this is very difficult to calculate. You know, your time can be eaten up very, very easily. You know, big decision for Black. Obviously, Carlsen is, well, looking to play b5. Is this a threat or not? So if Black is very worried, then he could block with queen b5. But then that allows White's queen into this beautiful central square, and suddenly, well, I can understand why Nakamura rejected this. This already looks a bit dodgy. What about e5? Why not just go for it with the e-pawn? Well, I'm afraid that would allow White's queen in, and suddenly that is 2 extra pawns, and that a-pawn looks too dangerous. So Nakamura played it very cool, actually. He played king g8, but you know, you need to invest a lot of time to understand this position, and also calculate moves like b5. This is what Nakamura would have been calculating. Carlsen did not play this, but of course it's a very dangerous continuation. And now a6, that pawn can roll, but queen a4 keeps everything under control. Okay, instead of a6, after this capture, what about queen a1? Now, if Black's queen has to defend passively, that's a disaster. But the queen can go on a counterattack. Now, Nakamura would have had to calculate this. And it turns out that White's king actually can't escape the checks here. But that is very difficult to see when you're, you know, facing, you know, not just Carlsen across the board, but you've got the clock ticking as well. But I think king g8 was a good move from Nakamura. Okay, what happened? Queen e1 from Carlsen. Now he couldn't see anything better than to play like this, trading pawns, and they reach almost by force the end. Well, we're about to see what endgame they reach. Queen c5, excellent move. So that means that the queen keeps tabs on this pawn, but also threatens checks here, and that's the problem. So actually, Carlsen, by force, has to go in for this. But basically, now, I mean, again, a big decision for Black. Big decision. You can keep checking the king, but I can understand why Nakamura declined to go in for this. You know, you can make a slip so easily here. One slip and that pawn goes through. Objectively should be fine for Black. But instead, Nakamura went for g5. So he's hoping to box White's king in. But of course, playing g5 leaves that pawn a little bit vulnerable. So Carlsen decided just to go for this endgame. I mean, this is incredible. It's fine margins. That pawn is going to drop. But theoretically, this is a drawn endgame. But that's only in theory. This is not at all easy when you're short of time, and yeah, you're under pressure here in the position. So this is how the game went. So Carlsen just kind of jockeying for position here, centralizing his queen, and that's clever. So it hands the move over to Black. And now, well, Nakamura, short of time, made a terrible blunder. He should wait with queen b1. It's all very well for me to say that. This is still very difficult to defend. But let me just show you a typical idea here, that when White tries to bring the pawn up the board, then suddenly there's lots of checks. And well, here's the main motif in the position. Once white gets here, then suddenly stalemate opportunities arise, and that should be a draw. But very difficult to wait for black in that position. So easy to make a mistake. And here, actually, under pressure, Nakamura blundered. King g6 and queen g8 was the final move of the game. Obviously, if the king steps across here, then there's a skewer. And if the king goes the other way, then it is checkmate in one move. Well, we've seen it 100 times before. Carlsen applying the pressure and his opponent cracking, and particularly in these kind of games with a fast time control, Magnus is absolutely deadly. So, after 4 games, Magnus Carlsen takes the lead. I have to say, it's fascinating watching these games. I don't claim to be an expert in Fischer random chess, but what I find very interesting is that very quickly from these fairly random opening positions, actually a normal game of chess arises, and so basically you've just cut out whole chunks of opening preparation. Very interesting.